Welcome to Baruch Menache's podcast. This is a space for rigorous exploration of human development, psychology, and social interactivity. Each episode examines the underlying structures of thought, behavior, and interaction, offering insights drawn from education, research, and philosophical reflection. Here we engage deeply with ideas, question assumptions, and illuminate the patterns that shape both individual growth and collective experience. Join me as we unpack complex concepts and translate them into understanding, perspective, and meaningful dialogue. To become part of the representation social process, what is that one has become objectified as a criteria of orientation for the communal sphere, then they automatically become disjointed from personal interactivity, as though there isn't a human side to their institutional process. They do not choose this manner. It is chosen upon them for the fact that they are being offered as an object of communal interest. And in this way, it puts them in a predicament where they can either become embellished with that objectivity to the furthest point of being lost in the inanimacy of that objectification, since animacy requires mobility between sequences. So in this case, the mobility continuously becomes lost in the concreteness of objects. We usually think of objects as the lowest tier of animacy or purpose, yet that is the criteria of becoming institutionalized or set in stone for communal interest, where one becomes lost of their animacy, their mobility of psyche, habituation, or social enterprise. That is, they are not represented in any other manner other than the way they choose to socialize their persona and external counterpoints, so that in this way one becomes the rock and stone where they're lost essentially from any animacy. But that's the furthest extent of this process. And an earlier point in the spectrum is when the individual contains some level of animacy or mobility, whether psychological or social, that allows them to move in and out of that objectivity such that they disenfranchise from the representation. However, in this case, it's not fairly simple of a process, since if we look at an object that is represented for the communal sphere, to lose that representation would mean to lose all sociality. One has to discount social interface. This might be easier when one can set a justification in mind that proves that the representation is not wholeheartedly embedded in all of sociality, such that sociality contains with it and beyond it. But in the case scenario of it being specialized for all sociality, one must distinguish themselves from all society in order to gain even the entranceway of their humanness or animacy, irrespective of that representation. Yeah. Thus, they are placed into a duality, which we wouldn't expect the complete disenfranchisement of society for that. Is a host of all other problems. Yet, to lose animacy, to lose the mobility of the objectification, is as well a determinate detriment value of that process. An individual of regular stature contains this duality naturally, but it is not between themselves and sociality, but rather the inverse, between themselves and themselves. Because they are not socially objectified, they are not part of the interest of sociality, what is contained within their psychological habit is rather twofold, one of being irrelevance and the other of being propositionalized to be relevant. We usually term this the masses or the general person of non-interest, which highlights the very self-denigration that is occurring. They experience in themselves being a part of the masses, being irrelevant in social happenstance. That irrelevancy is as well a representation in social sequence. They are represented in how they are not represented, so that all their psychological happenstance must deal with the irrelevancy, so that they move between irrelevancy and thus stagnation, despair, and a depressive state of existence, or moving away from that irrelevancy, which never fully becomes discounted, and then entering into a sphere of internal development. Irrespective of that, they discount the representation, which is true in its effect, but yet must deal with that duality because one cannot disenfranchise from that very representation of negation. What is interesting about this phenomenon is that there is no real change occurring in the psychological behavior between the individual objectified and that who deals with irrelevancy. For in both cases, there is a representation that disrupts the personal habituation, one being in negation, the other being in overconsumption or overindulgence of social interests. Thus, the duality is constantly existent, more so the criteria of freedom, if we were to call it that, of allowing some semblance of developmental structure and coherence between selfhood and sociality, would be in perfecting the duality of that process. In the case of irrelevancy, one not to ignore the notion of irrelevancy, thus to deal with the constant negotiation between and how they are almost non-existent of a purpose as well, despite that, to whatever developmental structure they choose to embark upon. Yet in the case of objectification, where one has become institutionalized as a communal interest, it is for them to become free in this duality by following the objectification based on its criteria of information, since it is a true point of sociality, as well disenfranchising from that to the respect of broader societal concern or non-societal interests. That is, that despite socialization as a whole, despite society as a whole, they enter their sphere of eternal process. We usually make it a demarcation that the latter case, in becoming a juncture of sociality, a object of social interest, that somehow this is the cause of disruption for their personal realm. Yet it is the very case and the inverse. For the individual that is performing such will perform in the other happenstance of becoming enthralled by irrelevancy, disturbed, overconsumed by it, taking a set of behaviors that will embark on a journey to almost become free of the irrelevancy, despite the very fact that the irrelevancy is fundamental in social sequence, and one has no ability of becoming free, to thus disturb their privatization, or at least the privatization that would be considered a developmental structure. It is not developmental to attempt to become free from what has become part of social sequence. Just as in the case of the individual of objectification, they have no ability of becoming free of their participation in social sequence. It is part of the object universe criteria And is this equal across both individuals? There is no difference other than the fact that we can articulate in a communal sphere the developmental structure of the individual that has become objectified in social juncture because of the very fact that it is part of social process, yet the individual that is beholden to irrelevancy as the inverse cannot be articulated because they are not part of social juncture only in the fact of their irrelevancy, so that its developmental structure consequently has no ability of social articulation. Thus, we assume it to be a one-sided deal, that it only occurs on one side. Rather, only on one side is it able ground for articulation. But if one follows the pedigree of that information to their individuality, if in the case of not being part of social sequence and a fundamental intersection, they notice the same process of irrelevancy as its representation.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.